ever watched someone laugh at the person who once gave them everything? Most people think divorce ends a marriage. Sometimes it only postpones the day the truth comes out. 10 years after signing the divorce papers, she laughed in his face at their high school reunion, completely unaware she had spent the last 20 minutes insulting the man who owned every chandelier, every table, and every brick inside the building they were standing in. And before the day was over, she would pay a price that she couldn't afford with her entire life savings. For almost 10 years, the people who knew Keanu Reeves believed they already knew how his story had ended. They remembered the divorce, the quiet man who packed his belongings into an old pickup truck, the husband who walked away without asking for the house, without arguing over the savings, without trying to clear his name, when friends quietly decided his wife had simply outgrown him. Some called him weak. Others said he lacked ambition. A few even whispered he was a nice guy. But nice doesn't build a future. Keanu never answered any of them because he'd learned something long before life ever tested him. When people are determined to misunderstand you, explaining yourself rarely changes their minds. Time usually does a much better job. There was another lesson he carried with him everywhere he went. Success that has to introduce itself usually isn't success at all. The strongest trees in the forest never make noise while they're growing. Before we go back to where it all began, if you enjoy stories where quiet strength speaks louder than pride, make sure you subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. We always enjoy seeing this incredible community joining us from all over the world. 10 years earlier, on the eastern side of Brookhaven, where maple trees shaded quiet streets and neighbors still greeted one another by name, life moved at a slower pace. Children raced bicycles until the streetlights flickered on. Retired couples watered flowers together every evening. On Saturday mornings, the smell of fresh coffee drifted through open windows, while lawnmowers hummed in perfect rhythm across the neighborhood. Nothing extraordinary was ever supposed to happen there. It was the kind of place where ordinary people built ordinary lives. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Near the end of Maple Street stood a modest brick house with white shutters and a small wooden porch. The paint had faded in a few places. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side. Wind chimes gently danced whenever the afternoon breeze found them. It wasn't the biggest house on the street. It wasn't the newest, but it was loved. Inside, Keanu sat at the dining table, repairing one of its chairs. The chair wobbled slightly whenever someone leaned against it. Most people would have thrown it away. Keanu never saw broken things that way. He loosened one joint, applied fresh wood glue, carefully tightened the clamps, then ran his hand across the polished oak with the same attention an artist gives a painting. A quiet smile crossed his face. "There you are," he whispered, "good as new." A voice came from the kitchen. "You're fixing that chair again." Keanu looked up. Vanessa stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee in her hands. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She simply watched him with the tired expression of someone who'd who'd begun questioning whether kindness alone could build the future she'd imagined. Keanu smiled. "Your father built this. It deserves another chance." Vanessa leaned against the doorframe. "You always say that." He chuckled softly. "Because I still believe it." She looked at the chair, then back at him. "Not everything can be repaired, Keanu." He didn't answer. At least, not right away. Instead, he carefully removed the clamps, set the chair back on the floor, and gently rocked it once. It stood perfectly still. Only then did he look at her. Most things can. Vanessa walked into the dining room, carrying a stack of unopened envelopes. She placed them quietly on the table between them. Mortgage payments, insurance notices, utility bills. Each one felt heavier than the last. Keanu glanced at them. He already knew what they were. "I'll take care of it," he said calmly. Vanessa gave a small smile, one that carried more exhaustion than hope. "You've been saying that for almost 2 years." The room fell silent, not because either of them was angry, because neither of them knew how to bridge the growing distance between love and reality. That afternoon, Keanu loaded his worn toolbox into the back of his pickup truck. His next job was across town, a place called Riverside Grand Hall, one of the oldest event venues in Brookhaven. For months, the owners had been renovating parts of the building. Most contractors rushed through the work. Keanu never did. He believed if your name was attached to something, it should outlive you. He had no idea that the building he was about to help repair would one day become the very place where life would quietly bring him full circle. Riverside Grand Hall had been part of Brookhaven for nearly 50 years. People celebrated their weddings there. Business owners hosted charity galas beneath its crystal chandeliers. Every graduating class eventually found itself dancing across its polished ballroom floor. It wasn't simply a venue. It was where the town collected its happiest memories. Keanu parked his old pickup beside the loading dock. As always, he arrived 20 minutes early, not because anyone expected him to, because his father had once told him, "If you're late, you're telling someone their time matters less than yours." Keanu had never forgotten it. Inside the ballroom, several contractors were already packing their tools. One of them laughed as Keanu walked in. "Look who finally showed up." Another smirked. "The perfectionist." Keanu simply smiled. "Morning." The first contractor pointed toward a section of decorative wood paneling. "We finished most of it." Keanu quietly ran his hand across the surface. It looked beautiful until he reached one corner. The panel shifted, barely half an inch, enough for nobody else to notice, enough for him to stop. He removed a screwdriver from his toolbox, tightened 2 hidden brackets, checked the panel again. Perfect. One contractor rolled his eyes. "You know, nobody would have noticed that." Keanu looked at the polished wall. "Maybe." He carefully packed away the screwdriver. "But I would have." From across the ballroom, an elderly gentleman had been watching the entire exchange. Harold Whitmore, the owner of Riverside Grand Hall. He slowly walked over. "You just saved me from replacing that entire wall. 5 years from now, Keanu smiled. It only needed 2 screws. Harold laughed. Most people would have left it. Keanu shrugged. Most people don't have to sleep, knowing they could have done better. Harold couldn't help smiling. You've got an unusual way of looking at work. Keanu looked around the ballroom. I don't think work should know whether someone's watching. The old man's smile slowly faded, not because he disagreed, because he'd rarely met anyone who actually lived that way. That evening, Keanu returned home. The house was unusually quiet. The television wasn't on. Music wasn't playing. Vanessa sat alone, looking through photographs on her laptop. Vacation pictures, birthday celebrations, smiles that seemed much older than the dates beneath them. She looked up. Can we talk? Keanu nodded. Of course. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Vanessa quietly asked, Are you happy? Keanu looked surprised. I think so. She lowered her eyes. I don't think I am. The words hung in the room. Heavy, honest, painful. Keanu slowly sat across from her. What happened? Vanessa shook her head. Nothing. That's the problem. She looked around the house. Every day feels exactly the same. You work. You come home. You fix something. You smile. You tell me everything will be all right. She looked back at him, but nothing changes. Keanu listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. Because sometimes people don't need answers. They need to know they've been heard. Vanessa continued. I thought by now we'd be somewhere else. A bigger house, more security, a different life. She forced a small smile. I know that sounds selfish. Keanu gently shook his head. No, it sounds honest. She looked at him, almost expecting an argument. Instead, he quietly asked, What do you want me to do? Vanessa stared at him for several long seconds, then whispered, I don't know anymore. That answer frightened Keanu more than anger ever could, because problems with solutions could be fixed, but uncertainty was something no toolbox could repair. Over the next several months, the distance between them grew so slowly. Neither of them noticed it at first. Dinner conversations became shorter. Weekend walks quietly disappeared. Laughter became something they remembered instead of something they shared. Friends still called them the perfect couple. They smiled in photographs, attended birthday parties, hosted family dinners. From the outside, nothing looked different. Inside, everything was. One rainy Thursday evening, Keanu walked through the front door, carrying a small paper bag. Vanessa looked up from the couch. What's that? He smiled. Your favorite lemon pastries. I had to drive across town to find them. For just a moment, she smiled the way she used to. Thank you. Then the smile slowly faded. Keanu, we need to stop pretending. The paper bag slipped slightly in his hand. Not enough to fall, just enough for him to realize life was about to. She took a slow breath. I think we should get divorced. The room became completely silent. The rain outside sounded louder than ever. Keanu looked at her, not angry, Not shocked, just heartbroken. After a long moment, he quietly asked, "Have you already decided?" A tear rolled down Vanessa's cheek. She nodded. Months ago, Keanu closed his eyes, only for a second. When he opened them again, there was no bitterness, only sadness. He quietly placed the untouched bag of pastries on the kitchen counter, then said something Vanessa would remember for the next 10 years. "If letting you go is the only way you think you'll find happiness, I won't stand in your way." 3 weeks later, the divorce papers were signed. There were no lawyers arguing across tables, no shouting, no courtroom battles. Keanu asked for nothing. Not the house, not the furniture, not even the old dining chair he had repaired so many times. He simply picked up his toolbox, his suitcase, and walked away. As he drove out of Maple Street, he looked once in the rearview mirror, not at the house, but at the life he had genuinely believed would last forever. 10 years later, the people attending Brookhaven High School's reunion would only remember one thing. Vanessa had divorced. The quiet carpenter. None of them knew. They had forgotten the rest of the story. For the first few months, life became remarkably simple. Too simple. Keanu rented a small one-bedroom apartment above an old hardware store on the edge of Brookhaven. The furniture didn't match. The kitchen barely had enough space for 2 people. The bedroom window overlooked a parking lot instead of a garden. It wasn't much, but every evening, when he closed the door behind him, the silence belonged to him. He never spoke badly about Vanessa. Not to friends, not to neighbors, not even when people quietly assumed she had made the right decision. Whenever someone asked what happened, he always gave the same answer. We wanted different lives. Nothing more, nothing less. One afternoon, while repairing a staircase inside Riverside Grand Hall, Harold Whitmore slowly climbed the steps, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've been quieter lately." Keanu smiled. "I didn't know that was possible." Harold chuckled. "I've lived long enough to notice the difference between peaceful and lonely." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply watched sunlight pour through the stained glass windows. Finally, Harold asked, "Do you miss her?" Keanu looked toward the empty ballroom. "I miss the future I thought we were building." Harold slowly nodded. "I know that feeling." Weeks turned into months. Months quietly became years. Keanu never stopped working. If anything, he worked even harder. Not because he wanted to become rich, because work was the only place where broken things usually stayed repaired. Every cracked handrail, every damaged stage, every loose floorboard, every broken window frame, he treated them all as though they mattered, because to someone, they always did. People around Brookhaven started noticing something unusual. Whenever a historic building needed restoring, someone always said, "Call Keanu." Not because he was the cheapest, not because he was the fastest, because when he finished, you couldn't tell anything had ever been broken. One rainy afternoon, Harold invited Keanu into his office. The The walls were covered with photographs, wedding receptions, charity dinners, school reunions, almost 50 years of memories. Harold slowly opened an old leather folder. Inside were financial statements, repair estimates, loan notices, past due tax bills. Keanu quietly looked up. Things aren't good. Harold gave a tired smile. I've spent 47 years keeping this place alive, but age catches buildings the same way it catches people. He walked toward the window, overlooking the ballroom. My children don't want it. They've built lives in other states. They told me to sell. Keanu looked across the ballroom. The chandeliers still sparkled. The dance floor still reflected the afternoon light. It didn't feel like a business. It felt like a piece of Brookhaven. I don't want to see it demolished, Harold quietly said. A developer already made me an offer. What kind of offer? They'll tear it down and build luxury apartments. Keanu looked around once more. He imagined the ballroom gone, the stage removed, the photographs thrown away, generations of memories reduced to concrete. Somehow, that hurt more than he expected. Harold noticed. You love this place, don't you? Keanu smiled softly. I think places remember the people who cared for them. The old man walked back to his desk, opened another drawer. This time, he removed a small brass key. He placed it gently on the desk between them. I've been watching you for almost 6 years. Keanu looked confused. Harold continued. I've watched contractors rush jobs. I've watched managers blame employees. I've watched investors only see numbers. He pointed toward Keanu. You see people. Keanu quietly shook his head. I don't have the money to buy this place. Harold smiled. I didn't ask. If you did. He slid a single envelope across the desk. Inside was a handwritten proposal. Not from a bank, not from a lawyer, from Harold himself. Owner financed. No investors. No silent partners. Small monthly payments. As long as Keanu promised. One thing. Keanu looked up. What? Harold smiled. Never let this building forget what it was built for. Keanu stared at the paper. He'd never owned a business, never managed a venue, never imagined something like this. It doesn't make sense. Harold laughed. It doesn't, if you're selling to the highest bidder. He looked around his office. But I'm not. I'm choosing the next caretaker. That evening, Keanu walked home, holding the envelope tightly beneath his arm. For the first time since signing the divorce papers, he didn't see an ending. He saw a beginning. Across town, Vanessa stood on the balcony of her new apartment, looking over the city lights. One of her friends smiled. So, have you heard from Keanu? Vanessa took a sip of wine, then shrugged. No, I hope he's doing okay. She paused before adding with a quiet laugh. He was always better at fixing old buildings than building a future. She had no way of knowing that at that exact moment, the future she believed he could never build was quietly being placed into his hands. Keanu didn't sleep much that night. The envelope remained on the small kitchen table long after the apartment lights had gone out. Every few hours, he walked over, opened it again, read every page, then quietly folded it closed. Not because he doubted Harold, because he doubted himself. Owning Riverside Grand Hall wasn't like repairing a chair. If he made a mistake, families wouldn't lose furniture. Employees would lose jobs. An entire piece of Brookhaven's history could disappear. The following morning, he drove back to the venue before sunrise. The parking lot was empty, the ballroom still dark. Only Harold's office light glowed upstairs. Keanu knocked gently. Harold smiled. "I had a feeling you'd come." Keanu walked inside, carrying the envelope. "I can't stop thinking about it." Harold leaned back in his chair. "Good. You shouldn't." Keanu placed the proposal on the desk. "Why me? You've known businessmen. You've known investors. You've known people with far more money." Harold smiled. "I have, and that's exactly why I chose you." He stood and walked toward the ballroom window. "When I was 35, I thought this building belonged to me." He quietly laughed. "Took me another 30 years to realize I belonged to it." Keanu remained silent. Harold continued. "There's a difference between owning a place and protecting it. I've watched you for 6 years. You never once acted like this building was somebody else's responsibility." He turned toward Keanu. "You already treat it like it belongs to you. You just don't realize it yet." The words stayed with Keanu long after he left the office. Over the next several weeks, he studied everything: event schedules, insurance policies, payroll records, tax documents, maintenance costs. There were nights he repaired broken door hinges until midnight, then sat in his apartment, learning business management until sunrise. He wasn't trying to become successful. He was trying to become worthy of the trust someone had placed in him. Months later, the paperwork was signed quietly. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no newspaper photographers, no speeches, only 2 signatures: Harold's, then Keanu's. Harold slid the brass key across the desk once more. This time, it belonged to Keanu. He looked at it for several seconds, then carefully placed it inside his pocket. Not like someone receiving property, like someone accepting responsibility. Harold smiled. "So, what's the first thing the new owner is going to change?" Keanu looked through the office window. At the ballroom below, employees hurried between tables. Florists arranged fresh roses. A janitor polished the marble floor. A young waitress struggled to carry too many chairs by herself. Keanu quietly walked downstairs. Without saying a word, he picked up half the chairs. The waitress looked embarrassed. "You don't have to help." He smiled. "I know." Harold watched from the office window, then quietly laughed to himself. "I made the right choice." Years passed. Not quickly, not dramatically, one season at a time. The leaking roof was repaired. The aging kitchen was modernized. The old ballroom lighting was restored instead of replaced. Historic photographs returned to the walls. Employees received better wages. Nobody noticed. Most of the improvements happened long before customers ever walked through the doors. Whenever someone congratulated Keanu for owning one of the finest venues in Brookhaven, he always gave the same answer. I don't own it. I just look after it until it's someone else's turn. The employees adored him, not because he was their boss, because half the time they forgot he was. If a dishwasher called in sick, Keanu washed dishes. If a waiter became overwhelmed, he carried trays. If a cleaner needed help after midnight, he grabbed a mop. Visitors often mistook him for another member of the staff. He never corrected them. One afternoon, a young employee nervously approached him. "Mr. Reeves, I've been offered another job. It pays more. I don't know what to do." Keanu smiled. "What does your heart say?" The young man looked surprised. "My heart." Keanu nodded. "Money, a chain, where you live." He gently placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "But purpose changes how you live." The young man stayed. Years later, he would become the venue's general manager. 10 years slipped by, almost unnoticed. The little brick house on Maple Street belonged to another family now. Harold had peacefully passed away. His portrait hung near the ballroom entrance, with a simple plaque beneath it. Some buildings are inherited, others are entrusted. One quiet afternoon, Keanu stood alone, adjusting fresh flowers near Harold's portrait. The general manager walked over carrying an envelope. "You've got another booking request." Keanu smiled. "Wedding?" The manager shook his head. "No." He handed over the file. "Brookhaven High School, 10-year reunion." Keanu casually opened the folder. His smile slowly disappeared. Printed across the first page was a list of attendees. Near the top, one familiar name, Vanessa Carter. He stared at it for several silent seconds, then quietly closed the file. The manager looked concerned. "Everything all right?" Keanu smiled again. Gentle, calm. "Yes." He handed the file back. "Treat them like every other guest." He turned and walked back into the empty ballroom, not knowing that 10 years after walking away with nothing, he was about to meet the only person who still believed he'd never become anything. The reunion was scheduled for the following Saturday evening. By Monday morning, Riverside Grand Hall had already begun preparing. Fresh flowers arrived first, then the decorators. The catering team confirmed the final menu. The ballroom floor was polished until every chandelier reflected like crystal across the marble. To everyone else, it was another event. To Keanu, it was simply another group of guests who deserved a memorable evening. Late Tuesday afternoon, the general manager walked into Keanu's office. "Would you like us to assign another supervisor for the reunion?" Keanu looked up from a stack of invoices. "Why?" The manager hesitated. "I noticed one of the names on the guest list." Keanu smiled gently. So did I. The manager shifted awkwardly. It might be uncomfortable. Keanu closed the folder in front of him. Only if I make it uncomfortable. He stood and looked through the office window, over the empty ballroom. You know, I've learned something. The manager waited. People usually don't remember how much money you had. They remember how you made them feel. The manager smiled. I'll tell the staff to treat everyone like family. Keanu nodded. They already do. Saturday finally arrived. By 6 o'clock, luxury cars began filling the parking lot. Old classmates stepped out laughing. Some hadn't seen each other in years. Others embraced, as though no time had passed at all. Stories began before people even reached the front doors. Gray hair, wedding rings, teenage children, successful careers. Life had left its fingerprints on everyone. Near the entrance, Keanu stood with several employees, adjusting the final seating chart. He wore a simple navy suit. No expensive watch, no designer shoes, no badge identifying him as the owner. To anyone walking past, he looked like another member of the event staff, exactly the way he preferred it. A black luxury SUV slowly stopped beneath the front entrance. The driver hurried around to open the passenger door. Vanessa stepped out, wearing an elegant gold evening dress. Behind her came her husband, Richard, a successful real estate developer, known throughout Brookhaven for talking almost as much as he invested. Richard looked up at the building. Not bad. I've been trying to buy this place for years. Vanessa smiled. The owner keeps refusing. Richard laughed. Everybody has a price. As they walked toward the entrance, Vanessa suddenly slowed down. Her eyes settled on a familiar face, standing beside the seating chart, holding a clipboard, speaking quietly with 2 employees. She blinked twice. Keanu. He looked up. Their eyes met. For the first time in 10 years, a polite smile appeared on his face. Hello, Vanessa. For just a second, neither of them moved. 10 years of memories, compressed into a single moment. Richard broke the silence. You two know each other. Vanessa forced a small laugh. My ex-husband. Richard raised an eyebrow. This guy. She nodded. The same one. Richard looked Keanu up and down, then smiled politely. So, still doing maintenance work? Keanu returned the smile. I still enjoy fixing things. Richard chuckled. Good. Somebody has to. Vanessa looked around the grand ballroom, then back at Keanu. I have to admit, this is nicer than I expected. She glanced toward the chandeliers. I guess the owners finally hired good maintenance people. Several classmates standing nearby laughed softly. One woman smiled. So, Keanu, what have you been doing all these years? Before he could answer, Vanessa replied for him. He always liked repairing old buildings. She laughed lightly. I suppose he's still doing that. Another classmate smiled sympathetically. Nothing wrong with honest work. Vanessa nodded. No, there isn't. She looked back at Keanu. It's just, I always hoped he'd dream a little bigger. Keanu simply smiled. I'm happy. Richard laughed. Happiness is important, but success helps. Several people nodded. The conversation drifted toward careers, investments, vacation homes, luxury cars, each person trying, in subtle ways, to prove life had rewarded them. Keanu listened quietly, never interrupting, never comparing, never trying to impress anyone. The more he remained silent, the more everyone assumed there simply wasn't much to say. Vanessa looked around once more, then smiled at the group. You know, I used to worry about Keanu, but seeing him now, she shrugged. I guess some people never really change. A few classmates laughed. Others looked uncomfortable. Keanu didn't react. He simply adjusted one of the place cards that had become slightly crooked, then quietly excused himself. If you'll excuse me, I need to make sure everything is ready. Richard smiled. Dedicated employee. Vanessa chuckled. He always was. Keanu walked calmly across the ballroom. One of the waiters approached him. Sir, the master of ceremonies says, we're ready whenever you are. Keanu glanced toward the stage, then quietly nodded. Give everyone 5 more minutes. From across the room, Vanessa watched him speaking with the waiter. She smiled to herself. I knew it. One of her old classmates frowned. Knew what? She took a sip of champagne. He still works here. She laughed quietly. I always told him, being kind doesn't automatically make you successful. Standing only a few feet away, the general manager heard every word. He slowly looked toward Keanu, waiting, expecting him to finally say something. Keanu simply smiled, then gently shook his head. Not yet, because he had learned long ago that some truths never needed defending. They only needed the right moment. At exactly 7 o'clock, the ballroom lights slowly dimmed. The master of ceremonies walked onto the stage, picked up the microphone, and smiled at the crowd. The conversations slowly faded. People found their seats. Laughter became whispers. The soft sound of silverware and glasses gave way to anticipation. The master of ceremonies adjusted his tie. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Brookhaven High School's 10-year reunion. A round of applause filled the ballroom. We've spent months preparing this evening, and we hope it becomes one of those nights you'll still be talking about 10 years from now. More applause followed. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, smiling. This place really is beautiful. Richard nodded. I'll admit, they've done an incredible job. The master of ceremonies continued. But before we begin dinner, there's someone I'd like to thank. He looked toward the entrance of the ballroom. This evening wouldn't have been possible without the generosity of one remarkable person. Several guests looked around. Most assumed he was talking about the reunion committee. The host smiled. Our venue has become one of Brookhaven's greatest landmarks. It has hosted weddings, charity galas, graduations, and tonight it welcomes all of us. He paused. But buildings don't become special because of walls. They become special because of the people who care for them. Vanessa quietly nodded. That's actually true. Richard looked toward the stage. I wonder who owns it now. The master of ceremonies smiled. I'd like everyone to help me thank the man whose vision preserved Riverside Grand Hall when it was only months away from being demolished. The ballroom became silent. He not only saved this building, he saved a piece of Brookhaven's history. Several guests began looking around the room, trying to guess. The master of ceremonies raised his hand toward the back of the ballroom. Our host tonight, Mr. Keanu Reeves. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Vanessa's smile froze. Richard slowly turned around, almost mechanically, following the direction of every other pair of eyes. Near the ballroom entrance, Keanu quietly set down the seating clipboard. One waiter handed him his suit jacket. Another employee smiled. You ready, sir? Keanu smiled back. As ready as I'll ever be. He buttoned his jacket, straightened his tie, then calmly walked toward the stage. Something extraordinary happened. Every employee, from the chefs in the kitchen, to the waiters, to the cleaning staff, stopped what they were doing. One by one, they applauded, not because they had been told to, because they wanted to. The applause grew louder, longer, warmer. It wasn't applause for a wealthy businessman. It was applause for a man who had carried tables beside them, washed dishes when they were short-staffed, stayed after midnight, helping clean the ballroom without ever mentioning he owned it. Vanessa couldn't blink. She watched Keanu walk past her table, calm, unhurried, exactly the same man she remembered. Only now, the entire room rose to its feet. Richard whispered, "No." His eyes widened. This can't be right. The classmate sitting beside Vanessa quietly asked, "You mean you didn't know?" She couldn't answer, because suddenly, every conversation she'd had over the last 10 years came rushing back. He'll never build anything. He's too comfortable being ordinary. Nice doesn't pay the bills. Each sentence now echoed inside her mind, louder than the applause. Keanu stepped onto the stage. The applause continued. He smiled politely, almost embarrassed by the attention. The master of ceremonies handed him the microphone. "Mr. Reeves, would you like to say a few words?" Keanu looked across the ballroom. Hundreds of familiar faces. Old teachers, former classmates, people who had once believed. They knew exactly how his life had turned out. His eyes briefly met Vanessa's. She immediately lowered hers. Keanu looked back at the audience, then smiled gently. "Thank you. I honestly wasn't expecting this." A few people laughed. He looked around the ballroom. "When Mr. Harold Whitmore entrusted this place to me, he asked me to make one promise: never let this building forget what it was built for." He looked up at the chandeliers, then around the room. "So every decision I've made has been guided by one simple question." He smiled. "When people leave here tonight, will they remember the building or the way they felt inside it?" The room became completely silent. Keanu continued, I've learned that success isn't measured by what belongs to you. It's measured by what still stands, because you cared enough to protect it. Several guests quietly wiped away tears. Even people who barely knew him could hear he meant every word. Vanessa sat perfectly still, looking around the ballroom. The chandeliers, the polished floors, the restored photographs, the employees smiling proudly at the stage. Then back at Keanu, she suddenly remembered the old dining chair, the one he'd refused to throw away, the one he'd said, "Things that carry memories deserve another chance." For the first time, she realized he hadn't just been talking about furniture. As the applause began again, the general manager quietly walked onto the stage. He leaned close to Keanu, whispered something into his ear. Keanu's warm smile slowly disappeared. He looked toward the ballroom entrance. 2 police officers had just walked inside, and they weren't there for the reunion. The applause gradually faded. People began looking toward the entrance. The officers weren't rushing. They weren't drawing attention to themselves. Instead, one of them politely approached the general manager, whispered a few words, then looked toward Keanu. Keanu walked down from the stage, met them halfway across the ballroom. The room became unusually quiet. Nobody could hear the conversation. They could only watch. One officer extended his hand. "I'm sorry to interrupt your evening, Mr. Reeves." Keanu smiled politely. "Is everything all right?" The officer nodded. "It is now." He handed Keanu a brown envelope. "We finally concluded the investigation." Keanu looked at the envelope for a moment, then quietly asked, "So, it's over?" The officer smiled. "Yes, completely." Across the ballroom, Vanessa leaned toward Richard. "What investigation?" Richard shook his head. "I have no idea." The officer continued. "We wanted to tell you in person. The man responsible has pleaded guilty. He'll be sentenced next month." Keanu quietly closed his eyes, only for a second. When he opened them again, there was relief, not satisfaction. Relief. The officer gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know, Mr. Whitmore, it meant a lot to you." Keanu nodded. "He did. For years, you refused to give up. You kept asking us to find the truth. We did." The officer offered a respectful nod. "I'm sorry it took this long." The 2 officers quietly left, without another word. The ballroom remained silent. Nobody understood what they had just witnessed. The master of ceremonies stepped forward. "Mr. Reeves, is everything okay?" Keanu smiled gently. "Yes, it finally is." He looked across the ballroom, then quietly spoke into the microphone once more. "I wasn't planning to share this, but perhaps tonight is the right night." Every guest listened. 10 years ago, the owner of this building became more than my employer. He became the father I needed when I had just lost my family. Harold's portrait hung quietly near the ballroom entrance, covered in fresh flowers. Keanu continued. "When he passed away, everyone believed he died of natural causes. He looked down briefly, but something never felt right. The room grew still. I spent years working with investigators, not because I wanted revenge, but because he deserved the truth. The officer's envelope remained on the podium, unopened. Keanu didn't need to read it. He already knew what it contained. Justice, he smiled gently. And tonight, for the first time, I know he can finally rest in peace. The ballroom erupted into applause. Not loud, not celebratory, respectful. Vanessa sat motionless. Her eyes drifted toward Harold's portrait, then back to Keanu. Suddenly, the last 10 years looked completely different. She remembered how she'd laughed at his old pickup truck, how she'd rolled her eyes when he repaired furniture instead of replacing it, how she'd called him a man without ambition. She'd been wrong, not because he'd become wealthy, because she'd spent 10 years measuring him with the wrong ruler. Dinner quietly began. The tension slowly faded. People laughed again. Old classmates shared memories. Music filled the ballroom. Vanessa never touched her meal. She couldn't. Every time she looked across the room, she saw Keanu, not sitting with celebrities, not showing off, not surrounded by bodyguards. He was helping a waitress carry heavy serving trays. A few minutes later, he bent down to help an elderly guest adjust a loose chair. Then he walked into the kitchen, carrying empty dishes. Richard frowned. Does he always do that? One employee overheard the question. She smiled proudly. Every event. He owns this place. He could sit in that office all night. She looked toward Keanu. But he says, titles don't carry tables. People do. Richard slowly lowered his eyes. He'd spent years believing leadership meant being served. Keanu had quietly proven it meant serving first. Near the end of the evening, Vanessa finally stood. She slowly walked across the ballroom. Each step felt heavier than the last. Keanu noticed her approaching. He smiled politely. Vanessa, she stopped in front of him. For several moments, she couldn't speak. Finally, she managed a quiet smile. I owe you an apology. Keanu looked at her gently. You don't owe me anything. She shook her head. No, I do. A tear slowly rolled down her cheek. I spent years telling people I left because you weren't building a future. She looked around the ballroom, then back at him. The truth is, I was too impatient to wait for the future you were already building. Keanu remained silent, not because he didn't forgive her, because some moments deserved silence more than words. Vanessa smiled through her tears. You know, I thought I won the divorce. She quietly laughed at herself. I don't think there were ever any winners. Keanu gently nodded. I've never believed life works that way. She looked at him one last time. I hope you're happy. He smiled, not proudly, not to prove anything. Simply, honestly, I am. Vanessa nodded. That single answer hurt more than any argument ever could, because she finally understood. The price she'd paid was never money. It wasn't the house. It wasn't 10 years. It was walking away from the one person who had quietly become exactly the man she'd always hoped he would be. And there wasn't enough money in her entire life to buy back those lost years. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The ballroom around them slowly returned to life. Music played softly. People laughed over old memories. Waiters carried desserts from table to table. It was as though the reunion had quietly continued, while two people finished a conversation that had really begun 10 years earlier. Vanessa looked around the ballroom one last time, then quietly asked, "Can I ask you something?" Keanu nodded. "Of course. When did all this happen?" She looked toward the chandeliers. "The venue, the business, the life you've built. I never heard about any of it." Keanu smiled gently. "Because I wasn't building it for people to hear about." She frowned slightly. "Then who?" He looked around the ballroom, at the employees laughing together, at an elderly couple dancing near the stage, at Harold's portrait watching over the room, then quietly answered, "Myself and the people who trusted me." Vanessa lowered her eyes. "I used to think success looked expensive." Keanu smiled. "A lot of people do." He picked up one of the dining chairs nearby, ran his hand across the polished wood. "You remember the chair I kept repairing?" A small laugh escaped her. "I used to think you were ridiculous." Keanu nodded. "I know." He looked at the chair. "The funny thing is, it was never about the chair." She looked at him, then finally understood. "It was about us." Keanu didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said enough. Vanessa wiped another tear from her cheek. "I wish I'd understood that sooner." Keanu looked at her kindly. "If you had, we probably wouldn't be the people we are today." She smiled sadly. "Do you ever regret letting me go?" Keanu thought about the question. Not for a second, for a lifetime. Finally, he answered, "I regretted it. For a long time, I regretted the dreams, the plans, the future I thought we'd have." He smiled softly. "But I never regretted choosing kindness, even when it hurt." Vanessa quietly nodded. She finally understood why no one had ever heard Keanu speak badly about her. He hadn't stayed silent because he was weak. He'd stayed silent because bitterness wasn't the life he wanted to build. Richard slowly walked over. He looked at Keanu, then extended his hand. "I owe you an apology too." Keanu shook his hand warmly. "For what?" Richard gave a quiet laugh. "I spent the last hour judging a man I hadn't even met." Keanu smiled. "We've all done that." Richard shook his head. "No, you gave me a lesson I'll probably spend the rest of my life remembering." Across the ballroom, the general manager approached. "Mr. Reeves, the staff would like to take a photograph before everyone leaves." Keanu looked surprised. "With me?" The manager laughed. "Not Not because you're the owner. He smiled. Because you're family. Minutes later, every employee gathered beneath the grand staircase. Chefs still wearing white jackets. Waiters, cleaners, florists, maintenance workers, managers. Some had worked there for 15 years. Others had only started the previous month. Keanu stood, not in the middle, but near the back, exactly where he always preferred to be. The photographer laughed. "Mr. Reeves, you should stand in front." Keanu shook his head. No, he looked around at everyone. This place was never built by one person. The employees smiled. Then one by one, they stepped aside until Keanu found himself standing exactly in the center. The photographer laughed again. "I guess they've made the decision. For you." Everyone burst into laughter, including Keanu. The camera flashed, capturing more than a photograph. It captured respect, loyalty, gratitude, the kind of family money alone could never buy. As the reunion came to an end, guests slowly made their way toward the exit. Vanessa paused beneath Harold's portrait. She quietly read the words engraved below it. Some buildings are inherited, others are entrusted. For a long moment, she simply stood there. Then she looked back across the ballroom at Keanu, helping fold tables, carrying chairs, thanking every employee before they went home. She smiled through tears, because at last, she understood something she should have understood years ago. He had never dreamed too small. She had simply been looking at the wrong blueprint. Long after the last guest had left, the ballroom became quiet again. Keanu walked to the center of the empty dance floor. The chandeliers reflected softly above him, just as they had the first day he'd repaired a loose panel. All those years ago, he smiled, not because he owned Riverside Grand Hall, but because he'd kept a promise to Harold, a promise to himself, to leave every place, every person, and every chapter of his life better than he found it. He switched off the ballroom lights, locked the front doors, and walked into the cool night air, not as the man who had proven everyone wrong, but as the man who had never needed to.